The blood hit the concrete in thick, rhythmic spurts, arterial bleeding, the kind that kills in minutes. Officer Maria Santos had been 3 steps from the exit when the screaming started. After pulling a brutal 12-hour shift, dealing with domestic violence calls and a 3-car pileup, all she wanted was to get home to her cramped studio apartment and maybe catch 4 hours of sleep before her next shift. The Chicago Police Department's downtown precinct stairwell was empty at 2:47 a.m., most officers having cleared out hours ago. But that scream, raw, terrified, the sound of someone who knows they're dying, stopped her dead. Maria bounded up the concrete steps 2 at a time, her service boots echoing in the narrow stairwell. On the 3rd-floor landing, she found him. A kid, maybe 19, sprawled in a growing pool of crimson. Broken glass glittered around him like deadly diamonds. The window he'd crashed through was still hanging in jagged pieces, and his left leg was twisted at an angle that made Maria's combat-trained eyes immediately assess the damage. Femoral artery, severed clean. 3 minutes, maybe 4 before he bled out completely. "Help me," Jake Morrison gasped, his face already pale and clammy. "Please, I can't stop it." Maria dropped to her knees beside him, her muscle memory from 3 tours in Afghanistan kicking in instantly. She'd seen this exact injury dozens of times in Kandahar province. IED shrapnel, sniper rounds, mortar fragments. The human body only holds about 5 liters of blood, and this kid had already lost at least 1. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice steady and authoritative. "What's your name?" Jake Morrison." "Okay, Jake, I'm Officer Santos, and I'm going to save your life. But I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me." She was already unbuckling her patrol belt, the thick leather perfect for what she needed. Her radio crackled as she switched to emergency frequency. "Dispatch, Officer Santos requesting immediate EMT response to 1247 West Harrison, 3rd floor stairwell. I have a 19-year-old male with severed femoral artery, massive blood loss, need trauma team standing by." "Copy that, Santos. ETA 12 minutes on ambulance." 12 minutes. Jake would be dead in 4. Maria wrapped the belt around his upper thigh, positioning it exactly 3 inches above the wound, close enough to cut off blood flow, far enough to avoid tissue damage. She'd done this procedure under Taliban fire, with helicopters crashing around her, with her own blood running down her face from shrapnel cuts. A quiet stairwell in Chicago was practically a medical spa compared to Forward Operating Base Chapman. "This is going to hurt," she warned Jake, then pulled the belt tight with practiced precision. The spurting blood immediately slowed to a trickle. "Officer Santos, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Detective Ray Kowalski's voice boomed from the stairwell below. Maria didn't even look up from her patient as the thick-set, 20-year veteran clomped up the stairs, his face already red with indignation. "Saving this kid's life," Maria replied calmly, checking Jake's pulse. "Weak, but steady." "Good. EMTs are 12 minutes out. He doesn't have 12 minutes. "You're not a doctor," Kowalski snapped, his breath reeking of the coffee and cigarettes that had sustained him through 2 decades of pushing papers and avoiding real police work. "Stop playing medic and let the professionals handle this." Maria ignored him, applying direct pressure to the wound with her free hand while maintaining the tourniquet. "Jake, tell me about school. You in college?" Community college," Jake managed. "Want to be an electrician? That's good work. Steady." "My uncle Luis was an electrician. Best job security in the world. People always need lights." She kept talking to keep him conscious, while simultaneously assessing his condition. Skin pale but not gray, breathing shallow but regular, pupils reactive. The tourniquet was holding. "Santos, I'm ordering you to step away from that suspect and wait for medical personnel." Kowalski pulled out his radio. "This is Detective Kowalski, requesting backup at 1247 West Harrison. Officer Santos is interfering with police business and practicing medicine without a license." "He's not a suspect, he's a victim," Maria said through gritted teeth. "And if I step away, he dies." Through the broken window, she could hear sirens in the distance. 7 more minutes. Jake's pulse was getting weaker, but the bleeding had stopped. Her tourniquet was working exactly as designed, exactly as she'd been trained to apply it by Army medics who'd learned their trade in the world's worst combat zones. Kowalski leaned over her shoulder, his voice dripping with malice. "You're done, Santos. Chief Montgomery's going to hear about this insubordination. You can't just ignore direct orders and play doctor whenever you feel like it." The sirens were getting closer. 4 minutes. "Jake, stay with me," Maria said, squeezing his shoulder. Help's almost here. You're going to be fine. The kid managed a weak smile. You really think so? I know so. I've seen worse injuries than this, and those guys made it home to their families. Heavy footsteps echoed in the stairwell as the EMT team arrived, led by Sarah Chen, a veteran paramedic who'd worked every major emergency in Chicago for the past decade. Sarah took one look at the scene and immediately began setting up her equipment. Perfect tourniquet placement, Sarah said, checking Maria's work. Textbook application. You definitely saved his life, officer. As the EMTs loaded Jake onto a stretcher, he grabbed Maria's hand. Thank you, he whispered. I was so scared I was going to die. You're going to be just fine, Maria assured him. But as she watched the ambulance disappear into the Chicago night, she noticed Detective Kowalski still talking into his radio, his eyes locked on her with unmistakable hostility. The look on his face told her that saving Jake Morrison's life was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. Maria Elena Santos had first learned to save lives in the burning sands of Afghanistan, where the difference between life and death was often measured in seconds and the wrong decision could haunt you forever. She'd enlisted in the army at 18, straight out of high school in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and economic necessity. Her mother, Carmen, worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and serving lunch at a school cafeteria during the day, but it was never enough. When diabetes started requiring expensive medications, and her father had walked out 3 years earlier, Maria knew the military was her only path to both serve her country and lift her family out of poverty. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston revealed something unexpected. Maria had a natural talent for combat medicine. While other recruits struggled with the technical aspects of trauma care, she absorbed every lesson about arterial bleeding, airway management, and shock treatment like a sponge. Her instructors, grizzled sergeants who'd seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, recognized something special in the quiet Puerto Rican girl who asked questions others were afraid to voice. Santos, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, had told her after she'd performed a flawless demonstration of tourniquet application, "You've got the hands and the head for this work. Don't waste that gift." She didn't. Over 3 deployments to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's Coast Province, combat medic specialist Maria Santos became legendary among the soldiers she served with. Under enemy fire, she'd crawled through dust and debris to reach wounded comrades. She'd performed emergency tracheotomies in the back of moving Humvees. She'd talked dying 19-year-olds through their final moments with a combination of professional competence and profound compassion that earned her the nickname Angel of Chapman. The Bronze Star citation was specific. For exceptionally valorous conduct while engaged in action against an enemy of the United States on 15 March 2018, when her unit came under intense mortar and small arms fire, Specialist Santos repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to treat wounded personnel. Despite being wounded herself by mortar fragments, she continued to provide medical care to 7 critically injured soldiers, saving multiple lives through her quick thinking and expert medical knowledge. But the Bronze Star couldn't protect her from Colonel Marcus Webb. Webb had been her commanding officer during her final deployment, a career military man who'd never seen real combat, but had cultivated the right political connections to advance steadily through the ranks. He was also a predator who'd learned to identify vulnerable female soldiers, those far from home, financially struggling, dependent on his recommendations for their future careers. The assault happened in his quarters after he'd called Maria in for what he claimed was a routine performance review. When she fought him off and escaped, Webb's expression had been coldly calculating rather than angry or embarrassed. He'd made his decision before she'd even left the room. The retaliation began immediately. Suddenly, Maria's performance evaluations started, including negative comments about her emotional instability and difficulty following orders. Training opportunities she'd been promised evaporated. Other officers, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began treating her with suspicion and distance. When Maria finally filed an official complaint through the proper military channels, the response was swift and devastating. Instead of investigating her allegations, the military hierarchy closed ranks around Webb. Her complaint was buried in bureaucratic procedures, her character was systematically destroyed through whisper campaigns, and she was ultimately discharged with a personality disorder classification that stripped her of veteran benefits and made her ineligible for VA medical care. The official discharge paperwork, signed by Webb himself, stated that Specialist Santos suffered from adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, and was unsuitable for continued military service due to personality disorder manifested by frequent conflicts with precinct, authority figures, and difficulty adapting to military structure. None of it was true, but truth was irrelevant when institutional power decided to protect itself. Returning to civilian life at 24, Maria found herself in an impossible position. Her military discharge made it difficult to find employment. Potential employers saw personality disorder on her records and assumed she was mentally unstable. The jobs she could find, retail clerk, restaurant server, security guard, paid barely enough to cover her own expenses, let alone help her mother with mounting medical bills. Carmen Santos's diabetes had worsened during Maria's deployment, requiring insulin, regular doctor visits, and medications that cost more per month than many people's rent. Without VA benefits, Maria was completely on her own financially, sending home every spare dollar while living in whatever cheap housing she could find. The decision to become a police officer had been both practical and idealistic. Law enforcement offered decent pay, health insurance, and the opportunity to continue serving her community. More importantly, it might allow her to use the medical skills she'd developed in combat to help people in emergency situations. But the Chicago Police Department proved to be almost as hostile to women as the Army had been, just more subtle about it. Chief Harold Montgomery, a political appointee with no law enforcement background who'd gotten his position through connections to Mayor Kellerman, had made his views on female officers clear from day one. "Women can do fine police work," Montgomery had said during Maria's orientation, his tone suggesting he believed the opposite. "But they need to understand their limitations. Police work isn't about being a hero or trying to do everyone else's job. It's about following procedures and maintaining order." Detective Kowalski, Montgomery's brother-in-law and loyal enforcer, had taken that message to heart. From Maria's first day at the precinct, he'd made it his mission to document every minor infraction, every moment of independent thinking, every instance where she'd shown competence that might make other officers look bad by comparison. Her performance evaluations were filled with subtle criticisms. Officer Santos tends to take initiative beyond her assigned duties, shows reluctance to defer to more experienced officers, may benefit from additional training and following departmental protocols. The irony was crushing. In Afghanistan, her initiative and medical expertise had saved lives and earned commendations. In Chicago, those same qualities were treated as character flaws that needed to be corrected. Now, at 28, Maria lived in a 400-square-foot studio apartment on Chicago's west side, furnished with a folding table, an air mattress, and a hot plate. Her patrol officer's salary of $45,000 per year was eaten up by rent, basic expenses, and the $800 she sent home monthly to help her mother afford insulin and blood pressure medications. She'd applied to nursing school twice, but the costs were prohibitive without veteran education benefits, and her work schedule made it impossible to attend classes regularly. Meanwhile, her mother's health continued to deteriorate, and the medical bills continued to mount. Every day, Maria put on her uniform, knowing she possessed skills that could save lives in medical emergencies, knowledge gained through years of combat experience and proven under the worst possible conditions. But department policy strictly forbade officers from providing medical care beyond basic first aid, citing liability concerns and insurance restrictions. The policy was insane from a public safety perspective, but it made perfect sense from a bureaucratic one. If officers weren't allowed to use their medical training, they couldn't be blamed if someone died who might have been saved. Better to let people die than risk a lawsuit. That mindset, prioritizing institutional protection over human life, was exactly what had driven Maria from the military. She'd hoped civilian law enforcement would be different, but she was learning that power structures everywhere operated by the same rules. Protect the institution at all costs, punish anyone who rocks the boat, and never admit that competence might matter more than compliance. 3 hours earlier, applying that tourniquet to Jake Morrison's leg, Maria had felt like herself again for the first time in years. For those crucial minutes, her training had mattered, her experience had been valuable, and her actions had directly saved a human life. Now, lying on her air mattress in the pre-dawn darkness, she had a sinking feeling that those might have been the last few minutes of her law enforcement career. The call came at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Maria's alarm was set to go off. "Officer Santos, this is Chief Montgomery's office. The chief needs to see you immediately. You are to report to headquarters before your shift begins." Maria had been expecting this call since she'd left the precinct 3 hours earlier, but her stomach still dropped as she heard the crisp, professional voice of Montgomery's secretary. In the background, she could hear phones ringing and the bustle of administrative activity that meant this wasn't a routine meeting. She threw on her uniform, pressed and starched despite her financial struggles, because appearance was one of the few things she could control, and drove through Chicago's empty pre-dawn streets with a growing sense of dread. The headquarters building loomed against the gray sky like a concrete fortress, its windows reflecting nothing back at her. Chief Harold Montgomery's office occupied the entire corner of the fourth floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan and enough space for a conference table that could seat 20 people. The walls were covered with photographs of Montgomery shaking hands with politicians, accepting ceremonial keys to the city, and posing with various civic leaders who had no idea he'd never made an arrest or solved a case in his life. Montgomery himself was a tall, thin man in his late 50s who wore expensive suits and maintained the kind of perfectly groomed appearance that suggested he spent more on personal grooming than most officers made in a month. He'd been appointed chief 18 months earlier by Mayor Kellerman, who valued political loyalty over law enforcement experience. When Maria knocked on the doorframe at exactly 6:00 a.m., she found Montgomery seated at the head of his conference table, flanked by 3 people who immediately made her understand the seriousness of her situation. Detective Ray Kowalski sat to Montgomery's right, a satisfied smirk on his face as he flipped through what appeared to be an incident report. To the chief's left sat Lieutenant Patricia Hawkins, the internal affairs officer whose reputation for ambitious ruthlessness was legendary throughout the department. At the far end of the table sat Richard Sterling, the department's legal counsel, a sharp-faced man in his 40s whose expensive suit and silk tie suggested he made considerably more money than anyone else in the room. "Officer Santos," Montgomery began without preamble, "please sit down. We need to discuss the events of this morning." Maria took the single chair that had been placed facing the others, immediately recognizing the deliberate power dynamic. 4 against 1. Authority figures versus patrol officer. Management versus labor. She'd seen this setup before in military disciplinary hearings. "Before we begin," Sterling interjected, his voice smooth and professional, "I want to make it clear that this is an official investigation into potential criminal conduct. You have the right to have union representation present, though I should point out that what we're discussing may be beyond the scope of union protection." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't just about department discipline, they were suggesting criminal charges. "I don't need a lawyer to explain why I saved someone's life," Maria replied evenly. Lieutenant Hawkins leaned forward, her cold blue eyes fixed on Maria with the intensity of a prosecutor addressing a hostile witness. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that concerns us, Santos. You seem to believe that good intentions excuse illegal conduct." "What illegal conduct?" Sterling opened a leather portfolio and began reading from prepared notes. "Practicing medicine without a license. A Class A misdemeanor under Illinois law. Violating department protocol by engaging in activities outside your scope of duty. Creating massive liability exposure for the city by providing unqualified medical care. Insubordination by directly refusing Detective Kowalski's lawful orders." Each charge hit like a physical blow. Maria had expected discipline, maybe suspension, but criminal charges for saving someone's life seemed impossible, even in the bureaucratic nightmare she'd come to expect from law enforcement. "I applied a tourniquet to stop arterial bleeding," she said carefully. "That's basic first aid." "No," Hawkins snapped. "That's practicing medicine. First aid is putting a band-aid on a cut or applying ice to a bruise. What you did requires medical training and carries medical liability. Did you check with the victim to see if he had any medical conditions that might be affected by your intervention? Did you document his vital signs? Did you consider whether cutting off blood flow to his leg might cause tissue damage or other complications?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to make Maria's split-second life-saving decision seem reckless and dangerous. She'd heard this technique before: take a successful action, examine it through the lens of everything that could have gone wrong, and make it seem irresponsible in retrospect. "He was bleeding to death," Maria said simply. "In 3 minutes he would have been dead. Everything else was secondary to that fact." Detective Kowalski finally spoke, his voice heavy with false concern. "Santos, I tried to help you out there. I tried to get you to step back and let the professionals handle it. But you ignored my direct orders and continued with your unauthorized medical treatment. That's textbook insubordination. Your direct orders were to let him die. My direct orders were to wait for qualified medical personnel, who were 12 minutes away from someone who had 4 minutes to live." Sterling made a note on his legal pad. "Officer Santos, your attitude is confirming our concerns about your fitness for duty. You seem completely unable to accept that your actions were inappropriate, regardless of the outcome." Montgomery, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost paternal, which somehow made his words more menacing than shouting would have been. Maria, I want you to understand something. The Chicago Police Department employs over 13 people. We have an annual budget of $1.8 billion. We interact with millions of citizens every year. Do you know how we manage an organization of that size and scope? Maria remained silent. Rules, Montgomery continued. Clear, consistent rules that everyone follows, regardless of their personal opinions or individual expertise. If we allow every officer to freelance based on their own judgment, we don't have a police force. We have 13 individuals doing whatever they think is right at any given moment. Sometimes doing what's right matters more than following rules. The words were out before Maria could stop them, and she immediately saw the satisfied expressions around the table. She'd just given them exactly the quote they wanted for their disciplinary file. Hawkins pounced immediately. And who decides what's right, Officer Santos? You? Should every police officer in Chicago get to decide which rules apply to them and which ones don't? I decided that a 19-year-old kid shouldn't bleed to death in a stairwell. That wasn't your decision to make, Sterling said sharply. That decision belongs to licensed medical professionals who are trained, certified, and insured to provide medical care. What you did was practice medicine without a license, and the fact that you can't acknowledge that makes you a danger to yourself and this department. Montgomery stood up and walked to the window, looking out over Lake Michigan as he spoke. Maria, I'm told you have military experience. You should understand chain of command and the importance of following orders. Detective Kowalski was the senior officer on scene, and his instructions were clear. His instructions would have killed that kid. His instructions were to wait for proper medical personnel, which is exactly what department policy requires. Maria felt the walls closing in around her. Every argument she made, every point of logic or humanity she raised, was being twisted into evidence of her unsuitability for police work. They weren't interested in the fact that Jake Morrison was alive because of her actions. They only cared that she'd violated procedure to save him. Sterling consulted his notes again. We've spoken with Dr. Kevin Rothschild, the emergency department director at Chicago General Hospital. He's extremely concerned about the precedent your actions set. He's informed us that he intends to file a formal complaint with the state medical board about your unauthorized medical treatment. The mention of Dr. Rothschild surprised Maria. She'd never heard of him, and wondered how he'd become involved so quickly in a situation that had happened less than 4 hours earlier. Dr. Rothschild has also expressed concerns about potential malpractice liability, Sterling continued. If your tourniquet had been applied incorrectly, if you had caused nerve damage or tissue death, the city could be facing millions of dollars in lawsuits. Did you consider that possibility when you decided to play doctor? I considered that he was going to die. Hawkins slammed her hand on the table. That's enough. Your arrogance is exactly the problem here, Santos. You think your military experience makes you qualified to practice medicine? You think your personal judgment trumps departmental authority. You think rules don't apply to you. I think saving lives is more important than covering asses. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria realized she'd just ended her career with that single sentence, but she was past caring about political niceties. Montgomery returned to his seat, his expression carefully neutral. Officer Santos, given your obvious inability to accept responsibility for your actions and your continued insubordination, we're prepared to offer you a choice. Sterling slid a document across the table. This is a resignation letter. If you sign it, this incident will be noted in your personnel file as a violation of department policy, but there will be no criminal charges and no negative marks on your permanent record. You'll be eligible for rehire with other law enforcement agencies. Maria looked at the resignation letter without touching it. The language was already prepared, stating that she was resigning to pursue other opportunities, and acknowledging that her actions had not met the professional standards expected of Chicago Police Department personnel. If you choose not to resign, Hawkins added, this investigation will proceed through formal channels. You'll be suspended without pay pending the outcome. Given the seriousness of the charges, termination is almost certain, and criminal prosecution remains a possibility. You have 24 hours to decide, Montgomery concluded. I suggest you use that time to think carefully about your future and what's best for everyone involved. As Maria left the headquarters building, she felt the weight of institutional power pressing down on her like a physical force. In the space of 1 hour, she'd been transformed from a competent police officer who'd saved someone's life into a dangerous rogue who threatened everything the department stood for. The worst part was knowing that Jake Morrison was alive and recovering in a hospital bed because she'd ignored Detective Kowalski's orders and applied her military medical training. But in the bureaucratic calculus of the Chicago Police Department, that success only made her transgression worse. She had 23 hours and 47 minutes to decide whether to surrender or fight. Jake Morrison woke up in Chicago General Hospital's trauma ward with tubes in his arm, monitors beeping steadily around him, and a crushing realization that he owed his life to a police officer whose name he didn't even know. The surgery had taken 4 hours. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma surgeon who'd repaired his severed femoral artery, explained that he'd lost nearly 2 liters of blood, almost half of his body's total supply. Without immediate intervention, he would have gone into hypovolemic shock within minutes and died before the ambulance arrived. "The tourniquet saved your life," Dr. Walsh told him, checking the surgical site where she'd reconnected his artery and repaired the surrounding muscle tissue. Whoever applied it knew exactly what they were doing. Perfect placement, proper pressure, textbook technique. You're going to make a complete recovery because someone with real medical training kept you alive until we could get to you. Jake's memories of that night were fragmented. The terrifying sensation of falling through glass, the warm wetness spreading beneath his leg, the certainty that he was going to die alone in a stairwell. But he remembered the woman's voice, calm and authoritative, talking to him about his plans for electrician training while her hands worked to stop his bleeding. He also remembered the other officer, the older man who kept shouting at her to stop helping him. The legal complications began the next morning, when his mother, Patricia Morrison, arrived at the hospital with family attorney David Kim in tow. Patricia was a single mother who'd raised Jake and his 2 sisters while working as a nurse's aide, and she developed a deep suspicion of authority figures who seemed more interested in protecting themselves than helping ordinary people. "They want us to sue the city," she told Jake after Kim had explained the potential civil rights and medical malpractice claims they could file. "The lawyer says the police department violated your rights by having an unqualified officer provide medical care. He thinks we could get a significant settlement." Jake stared at his mother in disbelief. "She saved my life, Mom. How is that violating my rights?" "That's not the point," Kim interjected, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair marking him as the kind of lawyer who specialized in high-profile civil rights cases. "The point is that the city allowed an unqualified person to perform medical procedures on you without your consent. What if she'd made a mistake? What if she'd caused additional injury? But she didn't make a mistake. I'm alive. You're alive despite inadequate medical care, not because of it," Kim insisted. "A properly trained paramedic would have arrived within minutes and provided appropriate treatment under proper medical supervision." Jake's sister Michelle, who'd driven up from Springfield, was scrolling through her phone during the conversation. Suddenly, she looked up with an expression of shock and anger. "Jake, you need to see this," she said, handing him her phone. The article was from the Chicago Tribune's website, posted just 3 hours earlier. The headline read, "Rogue Cop Plays Doctor, Endangers Victim in Downtown Incident." The article, written by Tom Kowalski, apparently Detective Kowalski's brother-in-law, painted a devastating picture of the previous night's events. According to the unnamed police sources quoted in the story, Officer Maria Santos had ignored direct orders from a senior detective and provided unauthorized medical treatment that could have resulted in additional injury or death. The article suggested that Santos suffered from PTSD related to her military service and had a history of difficulty following orders and working within established authority structures. It quoted an unnamed hospital administrator expressing concern about unqualified personnel performing medical procedures and mentioned that the incident was under investigation by Internal Affairs. Jake Morrison's name was mentioned only once, described as a 19-year-old suspect who was injured while allegedly breaking into the downtown police building. "They're calling me a suspect?" Jake said, his voice rising. "And they're saying she endangered me? She's the only reason I'm not dead." Kim leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "This is actually perfect for our case, Jake. They're already admitting that she acted outside her authority. The article practically writes our lawsuit for us. I'm not suing her. I'm not suing anyone. She saved my life." Patricia Morrison looked torn between her protective maternal instincts and her son's obvious gratitude to the officer. "Jake, honey, maybe you should think about this. The lawyer says we could get enough money to pay for college, maybe help with your addiction treatment." The mention of his addiction hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been breaking into the police building to steal copper wire and electronics that he could sell for drug money. His opioid addiction had started with prescription painkillers after a construction accident 2 years earlier. then progressed to street drugs when his prescription ran out and his insurance wouldn't cover additional treatment. "I was breaking the law, Mom. I was stealing. Officer Santos didn't hurt me. She saved me from the consequences of my own stupid decisions." Michelle was still reading the article. "Jake, listen to this part. They're saying she might face criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license. And there's a quote from some doctor saying her treatment was medically inappropriate and could have caused complications." Jake grabbed the phone and read the quote from Dr. Kevin Rothschild, Emergency Department Director. "While we're grateful that the victim survived this incident, we must emphasize that improper medical intervention by unqualified personnel can often cause more harm than good. A tourniquet applied incorrectly can result in permanent nerve damage, tissue death, or limb amputation. This type of freelance medical treatment sets a dangerous precedent and puts the public at risk." The quote made Jake furious. Dr. Rothschild hadn't examined him, hadn't reviewed his case, hadn't spoken to Dr. Walsh or the paramedics who'd praised Officer Santos's technique. He was attacking the woman who'd saved Jake's life without knowing anything about what had actually happened. "This is bullshit," Jake said, surprising his mother with his vehemence. "I'm not going to let them destroy her career over this." Kim tried one more time. "Jake, I understand your gratitude, but you need to think practically. The city will probably offer a settlement just to avoid bad publicity. We could be talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. How much money is someone's career worth?" Jake shot back. "How much money is worth destroying the reputation of someone who saves lives?" That afternoon, while his family debated legal strategy in the hallway, Jake used his phone to record a video. He was still connected to an IV drip and monitors, his hospital gown making him look even younger than his 19 years. But his voice was steady and clear. "My name is Jake Morrison," he began, looking directly into the camera. 3 nights ago, I almost died. I was doing something stupid, trying to steal from a building, and I fell through a window. I cut my leg really bad, and I was bleeding to death in a stairwell." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A police officer named Maria Santos found me. She could have just called for an ambulance and waited, but she didn't. She got down on her knees in my blood and she saved my life. She used her belt as a tourniquet and kept me conscious until the paramedics got there." Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Now I'm reading articles saying she did something wrong, that she's in trouble for helping me, that some people think I should sue her and the city because she wasn't qualified to save my life. That's insane. The doctor who operated on me said I would have died without that tourniquet. The paramedic who responded said it was applied perfectly." He leaned closer to the camera. "I don't know Officer Santos personally. I don't know anything about her except that she saved my life when she didn't have to. And now people are trying to punish her for it. That's not right. If you want to punish someone, punish me. I'm the one who was breaking the law, but don't you dare punish the woman who saved my life." Michelle helped him post the video to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, then shared it with her network of friends and college classmates. Within 2 hours, it had been viewed over 1,000 times. By evening, it had gone viral. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Officer Santos. Veterans shared their own stories of battlefield medicine and the importance of immediate trauma care. Medical professionals posted technical explanations of why tourniquets are crucial for arterial bleeding. Parents expressed gratitude that someone like Santos was protecting their communities. But the video also generated responses that surprised Jake. Other police officers began sharing their own stories of being disciplined for going outside their job description to help people. Nurses and EMTs described bureaucratic retaliation they'd faced for speaking up about safety concerns. Veterans talked about being blacklisted from jobs after reporting misconduct or assault. Dr. Walsh, Jake's trauma surgeon, saw the video that evening and decided to take action that would put her own career at risk. She pulled Jake's complete medical file, documented every detail of his injury and treatment, and prepared a comprehensive medical report that directly contradicted Dr. Rothschild's public statements. Her report was technical but damning. Patient presented with complete transection of left femoral artery with massive blood loss. Estimated blood loss at time of intervention, 1/800-2 0 Without immediate tourniquet application, patient would have progressed to Class 3 hemorrhagic shock within 2-3 minutes, followed by cardiac arrest and death within 4-5 minutes. The tourniquet was applied with perfect technique, proper placement, appropriate pressure, correct positioning, no nerve damage, no tissue necrosis, no complications whatsoever. This intervention was medically appropriate, expertly performed, and absolutely necessary to preserve life. Dr. Walsh concluded her report with a statement that would cost her politically but which her conscience demanded. Any medical professional who criticizes this life-saving intervention either lacks understanding of trauma medicine or is prioritizing politics over patient care. Officer Santos performed exactly as any qualified combat medic or trauma specialist would have performed in identical circumstances. As Jake drifted off to sleep that night, he could hear his mother and sister in the hallway, still talking with the lawyer about potential lawsuits. But he'd made his decision. Tomorrow, he would call every news station in Chicago if necessary to make sure people knew the truth about Officer Maria Santos. The woman who'd saved his life was in trouble for doing the right thing, and Jake Morrison wasn't going to let that stand. The video changed everything. By morning, Jake Morrison's testimonial had been shared over 10,000 times across all platforms. Local news stations were calling the hospital, requesting interviews, and the hashtag Justice for Maria had begun trending on Twitter throughout the Chicago area. Sarah Chen, the paramedic who'd responded to the emergency call, saw the video during her break at the firehouse and felt a surge of anger that had been building since she'd first heard about Officer Santos's suspension. Sarah had 22 years of emergency medical experience, had responded to thousands of trauma calls, and had seen plenty of situations where police officers either helped or hindered emergency care. What Officer Santos had done was textbook perfect, the kind of intervention that Sarah wished more first responders were trained to perform. Against the explicit orders of her supervisor, who'd warned all emergency personnel to avoid commenting on the ongoing investigation, Sarah called Channel 7 News and offered to give an interview about the medical facts of the case. "I've seen a lot of tourniquets applied by a lot of people over the years," Sarah told reporter Jennifer Hayes, speaking in her paramedic uniform in front of the ambulance she'd driven to save Jake Morrison. What Officer Santos did was absolutely perfect. Proper placement, correct pressure, appropriate technique. That young man would be dead right now if she hadn't intervened. The reporter pressed for details. "But wasn't she operating outside her training and authority?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Let me tell you something about training and authority. I've seen doctors make mistakes with tourniquets. I've seen nurses apply them incorrectly. I've seen paramedics screw them up under pressure. What Officer Santos did showed more medical competence than I see from a lot of people with official medical credentials." She paused, choosing her words carefully but speaking with obvious conviction. The people criticizing her have never been on their knees in someone's blood, watching them die, knowing that you have 30 seconds to make the right decision or they're gone forever. Officer Santos made the right decision under the worst possible circumstances, and now she's being punished for it. That's not justice. That's bureaucracy protecting itself at the expense of public safety. The interview aired that evening and immediately generated hundreds of calls to the station, with overwhelming support for Officer Santos and criticism of the police department's handling of the situation. Meanwhile, at VFW Post 1337 on Chicago's South Side, Commander Marcus Rodriguez was getting angrier by the hour as he learned more about Maria Santos's case. Rodriguez, a decorated Marine Corps veteran who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, had heard whispers about the female officer who'd been suspended for providing medical aid, but Jake Morrison's video had filled in the details that made his blood boil. "They're destroying this woman for doing exactly what we trained her to do in combat," Rodriguez told his executive committee that evening. "She's a Bronze Star recipient who saved lives under enemy fire, and now some pencil, pushing police chief wants to end her career for saving one more life." Rodriguez had been fighting bureaucratic battles with the VA for decades, advocating for veterans who'd been denied benefits or had their service records questioned by administrators who'd never worn a uniform. He recognized the pattern immediately, an institution closing ranks to protect itself by sacrificing someone who'd actually done the job. The VFW's response was swift and public. Rodriguez organized a press conference for the next morning outside the police headquarters, inviting every veteran organization in Chicago to participate. Within hours, he'd confirmed attendance from the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and Vietnam Veterans of America. But the story that was really driving public outrage was emerging from social media, where Officer Santos's background was being revealed in bits and pieces by people who'd known her in the military. Former Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen, no relation to paramedic Sarah Chen, had served with Maria at Forward Operating Base Chapman and posted a detailed account of her service record on Facebook. "Maria Santos is one of the best combat medics I ever served with. I watched her crawl through enemy fire to treat wounded soldiers. I watched her perform emergency surgery in the back of a moving vehicle while taking mortar fire. She saved my life, and the lives of at least a dozen other soldiers that I know of. The idea that she's not qualified to apply a tourniquet is absolutely insane. The post included photos of Maria in uniform, receiving her Bronze Star and working on wounded soldiers in field conditions that made a Chicago stairwell look like a sterile operating room. Other veterans began sharing similar stories, painting a picture of exceptional competence and courage under fire that directly contradicted the police department's narrative about her unsuitability for emergency situations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, meanwhile, was facing intense pressure from Chicago General Hospital's administration to retract her medical report supporting Officer Santos. Hospital CEO Robert Sterling, brother of police department lawyer Richard Sterling, though this connection wasn't yet public knowledge, called Walsh into his office for what he described as a clarification meeting. "Jennifer, I understand you feel strongly about this case," Sterling said, his tone suggesting fatherly concern rather than administrative threat. "But I think you may be missing the bigger picture here. Dr. Rothschild has significant concerns about the liability implications of endorsing unauthorized medical intervention." Dr. Walsh had expected this conversation and had prepared for it carefully. "Bob, I've reviewed the medical facts of this case thoroughly. The patient would have died without immediate intervention. The intervention was performed perfectly. Those are medical facts, not opinions." "But the policy implications," Walsh interrupted, "are that if we criticize life-saving medical intervention, we're prioritizing bureaucratic convenience over patient care. How do we explain that to our own emergency staff? How do I tell my trauma nurses that perfect medical technique is wrong if it's performed by someone without the right paperwork?" Sterling's expression grew colder. "Jennifer, Dr. Rothschild chairs the medical review board that oversees trauma department protocols. He also sits on the credentialing committee that reviews physician privileges. I hope you'll consider the broader implications of your position." The threat was clear but unspoken, challenged Dr. Rothschild's position on this case, and faced professional retaliation that could end her career. But Walsh had been a trauma surgeon for 15 years, and she'd seen too many people die from bureaucratic delays and administrative cowardice to back down now. "My position is based on medical facts and professional ethics," she replied. "I'm not going to change it to protect someone's political agenda." As word of Dr. Walsh's stand spread through the hospital's medical staff, other physicians and nurses began to speak up privately in support of Officer Santos. While few were willing to make public statements that might jeopardize their careers, the internal pressure was building for the hospital to reconsider its position. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Chicago City Councilwoman Aisha Johnson, whose district included both the precinct where Officer Santos worked and the neighborhood where Jake Morrison lived. Johnson, a former civil rights lawyer who'd been elected 2 years earlier on a platform of police accountability and community justice, had been following the story through social media and constituent calls. Her office had received over 200 phone calls in 24 hours, with callers expressing outrage about Santos's suspension and demanding city council action. "This case represents everything wrong with our approach to public safety," Johnson announced at an impromptu press conference outside City Hall. "We have a highly trained, decorated military veteran who saved someone's life, and instead of honoring her, we're punishing her. Meanwhile, officers who abuse their authority face no consequences whatsoever." Johnson's statement was carefully crafted to highlight the broader issues at stake. She'd done her research on Chief Montgomery's record, discovering that he'd failed to discipline multiple officers for excessive force complaints while pursuing aggressive disciplinary action against officers who challenged department culture. "I'm calling for a full city council investigation into this case and into Chief Montgomery's leadership of our police department," Johnson continued. "The people of Chicago deserve to know why competence is being punished while incompetence is protected." The political pressure was exactly what Mayor Robert Kellerman had hoped to avoid. Kellerman had appointed Montgomery precisely because he was politically loyal and wouldn't create controversies that might affect the mayor's re-election chances. Now, one suspended police officer was threatening to become a citywide scandal that could dominate news coverage for weeks. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, with CNN and Fox News both running segments about the Chicago police officer suspended for saving someone's life. The national attention brought new scrutiny to Chief Montgomery's background and leadership record, with reporters discovering his complete lack of law enforcement experience and his history of controversial appointments. But the most powerful moment of the day came when Jake Morrison, still recovering from surgery but determined to support the woman who'd saved his life, discharged himself from the hospital against medical advice to attend the veteran's press conference. Wearing civilian clothes and walking with a slight limp, Jake stood next to Commander Rodriguez and spoke directly to the cameras. These veterans know what Officer Santos did because they've done it themselves. They've saved lives under impossible conditions, and they know competence when they see it. I'm alive because Officer Santos ignored the people telling her to follow rules instead of saving lives. If that's the kind of officer Chicago doesn't want, then Chicago doesn't deserve officers like her. As the press conference concluded, Rodriguez announced that veteran organizations across the country were organizing support for Officer Santos, with protests planned in dozens of cities if the Chicago Police Department proceeded with her termination. The bureaucratic machinery that Chief Montgomery thought would quietly dispose of a troublesome officer had instead created a national controversy that was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's control. The independent investigation that Councilwoman Aisha Johnson commissioned revealed a web of corruption, cronyism, and systematic retaliation that reached far beyond Officer Maria Santos's case. Carmen Vasquez, the former FBI agent hired to conduct the investigation, had spent 25 years exposing government corruption and had developed a reputation for following financial trails that other investigators missed. Within 48 hours of beginning her review, she'd identified enough procedural violations and suspicious connections to justify expanding her inquiry far beyond the original scope. The timeline alone tells you everything you need to know, Vasquez told Johnson during their first briefing. Detective Kowalski filed his initial complaint against Santos before the ambulance had even left the scene. Chief Montgomery contacted Dr. Santos by Rothschild at Chicago General within 2 hours of the incident, before any formal investigation had begun. The department's lawyer prepared termination paperwork before Internal Affairs had interviewed a single witness. Vasquez spread out a timeline chart on Johnson's conference table, with color-coded entries showing the sequence of events. This wasn't an investigation. It was an orchestrated hit job designed to destroy Officer Santos as quickly as possible. The financial connections she'd uncovered were even more disturbing. Dr. Kevin Rothschild's emergency department had received $2.3 million in city contracts over the past 18 months, all awarded without competitive bidding and all approved personally by Chief Montgomery. The contracts covered emergency medical consulting and trauma response training for the police department, services that had never been provided. Richard Sterling's law firm had been even more successful, receiving $4.1 million in city legal work since Montgomery's appointment, including several high-profile cases where the city had settled excessive force lawsuits without admitting wrongdoing. But the most shocking discovery concerned Colonel Marcus Webb, Officer Santos's former commanding officer who had sexually assaulted her and orchestrated her military discharge. Webb now operated a private military contracting company that had received $800 in Chicago PD training contracts, all approved by Montgomery and all awarded without competitive bidding. They've created a closed loop of corruption, Vasquez explained. Montgomery awards no-bid contracts to his allies. They provide political support for his decisions, and anyone who threatens the system gets destroyed. Santos didn't just violate department policy, she demonstrated competence that makes their incompetence obvious. Johnson studied the financial documents with growing anger. How long has this been going on? Based on the contract patterns, since the day Montgomery was appointed. But I think Santos's case is special because she represents everything they're trying to suppress: actual competence, military experience, and the kind of independent judgment that threatens their authority. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Officer Tom Bradley, the Vietnam veteran nearing retirement, contacted Vasquez through a secure channel and offered to provide evidence he'd been secretly collecting for months. Bradley had been documenting conversations, recording meetings, and photographing documents after becoming suspicious about the systematic harassment of competent officers who challenged department culture. His evidence included recordings of Chief Montgomery and Detective Kowalski explicitly discussing plans to get rid of Santos because she made other officers look bad and didn't know her place. The most damaging recording captured Montgomery talking to Dr. Rothschild about the Santos case. "Kevin, I need you to make a statement about this Santos situation. Something about unauthorized medical treatment being dangerous, liability concerns, that kind of thing. Harold, I haven't even reviewed the case. I don't know what actually happened." "You don't need to know what happened. You just need to say that police officers shouldn't be playing doctor. Can you do that for me?" "I suppose so, but..." "Good. And Kevin? The city's emergency medical contracts are coming up for renewal next month. I'd hate to see budget constraints affect our partnership. The quid pro quo was explicit and recorded in perfect digital quality. Bradley had also documented systematic retaliation against other officers who demonstrated initiative or competence. Officer Lisa Park, the rookie who'd supported Santos, had been written up 4 times in 2 weeks for minor infractions that were typically overlooked. Officer James Murphy had been transferred to the night shift after questioning Detective Kowalski's handling of a domestic violence case. "They're running a protection racket," Bradley told Vasquez during a clandestine meeting in a downtown parking garage. "Montgomery and his cronies get rich off city contracts, and anyone who makes them look bad gets destroyed." Santos was just the latest target. But Bradley's most explosive evidence concerned the systematic cover-up of sexual misconduct within the department. He documented multiple cases where female officers had been forced out after reporting harassment or assault, while the officers they'd accused received promotions or favorable assignments. "Santos isn't just being punished for medical intervention," Bradley explained. "She's being punished for being competent while female, experienced while young, and principled while everyone around her is corrupt." Meanwhile, Dr. Jennifer Walsh was conducting her own investigation into Dr. Rothschild's background and qualifications. What she discovered undermined his credibility completely. Rothschild had been appointed emergency department director not because of his medical expertise. His residency training was in internal medicine, not emergency medicine, but because of his political connections to the mayor and city council. He'd never worked in a trauma center, had never treated combat injuries, and had never applied a tourniquet in an emergency situation. His public criticism of Officer Santos was based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience, and his claim that her intervention was medically inappropriate contradicted the opinion of every trauma surgeon and emergency physician who'd actually reviewed the case. Walsh compiled her findings into a detailed report that systematically dismantled Rothschild's credibility and highlighted his lack of relevant experience. She also discovered that he'd made similar statements in previous cases where police officers had provided medical assistance, always supporting the department's position regardless of the medical facts. The report concluded that Dr. Rothschild was either incompetent to evaluate emergency trauma interventions or deliberately misrepresenting medical facts for political purposes. Walsh submitted her findings to the medical board, the hospital administration, and Councilwoman Johnson's investigation, knowing that challenging Rothschild's credibility would likely end her career at Chicago General Hospital. The pressure campaign against Walsh intensified immediately. Her surgical schedule was reduced, her research funding was questioned, and she was excluded from administrative meetings where trauma protocols were discussed. But her reputation among nursing staff and other physicians was so strong that the retaliation only strengthened support for her position. The investigation reached a crucial point when Vasquez obtained Santos's complete military records through veteran advocacy channels and Freedom of Information Act requests. The documents revealed not only her exceptional service record, but also the systematic retaliation she'd faced for reporting sexual assault. Colonel Webb's efficiency reports on Santos before her assault complaint described her as an exceptional medic with superior technical skills and outstanding leadership potential, who was recommended for accelerated promotion and additional medical training. After her complaint, the report suddenly changed tone, describing the same officer as emotionally unstable, resistant to authority, and unsuitable for continued military service. The pattern was identical to her experience with the Chicago Police Department. Competence and integrity transformed into character defects through administrative manipulation. Vasquez's final report connected all the threads: financial corruption, systematic retaliation against women and competent officers, abuse of authority to protect personal interests, and conspiracy to destroy anyone who threatened the established power structure. Officer Santos wasn't suspended for violating policy, Vasquez concluded. She was suspended for demonstrating that policy violations are sometimes necessary to save lives, and that competence matters more than compliance. In Montgomery's Chicago Police Department, those are dangerous ideas that threaten everything the leadership represents. The report recommended immediate termination of Chief Montgomery, Detective Kowalski, and Lieutenant Hawkins, criminal investigation of the contract fraud scheme, and complete restructuring of the department's disciplinary procedures. It also recommended that Officer Santos be not only reinstated, but commended for exceptional performance under extreme circumstances. As word of the investigation's findings began to leak through City Hall, Mayor Kellerman found himself facing the choice he'd hoped to avoid: sacrifice his political allies to save his own career, or go down with the corrupt system he'd created. The decision became easier when federal investigators, alerted by Vasquez's findings, opened their own inquiry into the city's contracting practices and pattern of civil rights violations. Within hours, it would become clear that saving Jake Morrison's life had exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of Chicago's government. The disciplinary hearing that was supposed to quietly dispose of Officer Maria Santos instead became a public spectacle that exposed the corruption at the heart of the Chicago Police Department. Despite attempts to limit media access and public attendance, the hearing room on the 5th floor of police headquarters was packed with reporters, veterans, medical professionals, and community members who'd been following the case since Jake Morrison's video went viral. Chief Montgomery had hoped to conduct the hearing with minimal attention, but Councilwoman Johnson's investigation and the national media coverage had made that impossible. Maria sat at a small table facing the 5-member disciplinary panel, accompanied by Elena Morales, the civil rights attorney who'd agreed to represent her pro bono after being contacted by the veterans of foreign wars. Morales was a formidable advocate with 15 years of experience fighting institutional discrimination and a reputation for turning defensive proceedings into exposés of official misconduct. The panel itself told the story of the department's corruption. Chief Montgomery sat at the center, flanked by Lieutenant Patricia Hawkins and 3 neutral administrators, Deputy Chief Robert Carson, Personnel Director Margaret Foster, and Legal Advisor Thomas Beck, all of whom owed their positions to Montgomery's patronage. Richard Sterling, the department's counsel, opened the proceedings with theatrical flair, clearly expecting his presentation to be broadcast on local news. Members of the panel, we are here today to address a serious breach of department policy and public safety protocols, Sterling began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than evidence. Officer Santos, despite explicit orders from a supervising detective, chose to engage in unauthorized medical treatment that could have resulted in additional injury or death to the victim. Sterling paced in front of the panel as he spoke, creating visual drama for the cameras. While we can all be grateful that this incident did not result in tragedy, we must ask ourselves, what precedent are we setting if we allow individual officers to ignore direct orders and freelance medical treatment based on their personal judgment? He turned to face Maria directly. Officer Santos has shown a pattern of insubordination and resistance to authority dating back to her military service, where she was discharged for similar issues with following orders and working within established command structures. The attack on Maria's military record was exactly what Elena Morales had been waiting for. She rose from her chair with a slight smile that suggested Sterling had just made a critical mistake. Your Honor, if counsel is going to reference my client's military record, I'd like to enter into evidence her complete service file, including her Bronze Star citation and the actual circumstances of her discharge. Morales approached the panel with a thick folder of documents. Officer Santos was awarded the Bronze Star for repeatedly exposing herself to enemy fire to treat wounded soldiers, saving multiple lives through expert medical intervention under combat conditions. Her discharge came after she reported sexual assault by her commanding officer, retaliation that mirrors exactly what we're seeing in this proceeding. She placed a photograph on the evidence table showing Maria in combat gear, treating a wounded soldier while explosions lit up the background. This is the woman you're calling unqualified to apply a tourniquet to stop arterial bleeding. The room erupted in murmurs as people processed the contradiction between Sterling's characterization and the visual evidence of Maria's heroism. Montgomery banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. Sterling attempted to regain momentum by calling Dr. Kevin Rothschild as his first witness, appearing via video link from his hospital office. Rothschild's testimony was carefully rehearsed, focusing on the theoretical dangers of unauthorized medical treatment and the importance of leaving medical care to licensed professionals. Tourniquet application, when performed incorrectly, can result in permanent nerve damage, tissue death, or limb amputation, Rothschild testified, his voice carrying the authority of someone with emergency department director beneath his name on screen. Police officers simply do not have the training or qualification to make these critical medical decisions. Morales approached the cross-examination with surgical precision. Dr. Rothschild, what is your specific training in combat trauma medicine? I don't see how that's relevant. Please answer the question. Do you have experience treating battlefield injuries, gunshot wounds, or traumatic amputations? My expertise is in emergency medicine broadly. That's not what I asked. Have you ever applied a tourniquet in a life-threatening emergency? The pause was long enough to be damaging. Not personally, but have you ever treated arterial hemorrhage in a field setting without surgical facilities available? Another pause. Emergency departments are equipped to handle. Dr. Rothschild, did you examine Jake Morrison after his injury? No, but I reviewed. Did you speak to the trauma surgeon who operated on him? I didn't see the need. Did you speak to the paramedics who responded to the scene? The medical facts were clear from, Morales interrupted with documents in her hand. Actually, Dr. Rothschild, the medical facts are very clear. I have here a report from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma surgeon who actually treated Mr. Morrison. Would you like me to read her conclusions about Officer Santos's medical intervention? Before Rothschild could object, Morales began reading. The tourniquet was applied with perfect technique, proper placement, appropriate pressure, correct positioning. No nerve damage, no tissue necrosis, no complications whatsoever. This intervention was medically appropriate, expertly performed, and absolutely necessary to preserve life. She looked up at the video screen where Rothschild's face was visibly flushed. Dr. Walsh also notes that you contacted her hospital administration to pressure her into retracting this report. Is that true? Sterling jumped to his feet. Objection! This line of questioning is irrelevant to the disciplinary charges. It goes directly to the credibility of the witness and the department's pattern of retaliation against anyone who contradicts their narrative, Morales shot back. Montgomery, realizing that the hearing was spiraling beyond his control, tried to call a recess, but Morales wasn't finished. Dr. Rothschild, I have medical board records showing that you've previously testified against police officers who provided medical assistance, always supporting department positions regardless of the medical facts. Isn't it true that your emergency department has received over $2 million in city contracts since Chief Montgomery was appointed? The video connection suddenly went dark. I'm sorry, Rothschild's voice came through the speakers, but I seem to be having technical difficulties. The obvious evasion drew laughter from the gallery, further undermining the department's case. Morales then called Jake Morrison as her first witness. Still walking with a slight limp but determined to support the woman who'd saved his life, Jake approached the witness chair while the hearing room fell completely silent. Mr. Morrison, Morales began gently, can you tell the panel what happened in that stairwell? Jake's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. He described the terror of realizing he was bleeding to death, the calm professionalism of Officer Santos as she worked to save him, and the contrasting behavior of Detective Kowalski, who seemed more interested in asserting authority than preserving life. I was dying, Jake said, looking directly at the panel members. Officer Santos saved my life. Now you want to punish her for it. I don't understand how that makes sense. Sterling's cross-examination backfired spectacularly when he tried to suggest that Jake's drug addiction made his testimony unreliable. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you were under the influence of narcotics at the time of this incident? I was addicted to opioids, Jake replied without shame. That's why I was trying to steal copper wire to sell it for drug money. Officer Santos knew I was an addict, knew I was a criminal, and she saved my life anyway. That's the kind of person you're trying to destroy. The emotional power of Jake's words clearly affected several panel members, and Sterling quickly ended his questioning. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared as the next witness, testifying via secure video link from her office at Chicago General Hospital. Her medical expertise was unquestionable, and her defense of Officer Santos's intervention was technically detailed and professionally authoritative. In my 15 years as a trauma surgeon, I have never seen a more perfectly applied field tourniquet, Walsh testified. Officer Santos's technique was flawless, her assessment was correct, and her intervention was absolutely necessary. Any criticism of her actions is either medically ignorant or politically motivated. Walsh's testimony became even more powerful when she revealed the pressure she'd faced from hospital administration to retract her support for Officer Santos. Dr. Rothschild, who has never treated a trauma patient in his career, threatened my surgical privileges and research funding unless I changed my medical opinion. I refused because my professional ethics don't allow me to compromise patient care for political convenience. The hearing reached its climactic moment when Morales played Officer Bradley's recordings of Chief Montgomery and Detective Kowalski discussing their plans to destroy Officer Santos's career. The room listened in stunned silence as Montgomery's voice came through the speakers. Santos makes the whole department look bad by being too competent. We need to get rid of her before other officers start thinking they should actually use their brains instead of following orders. Kowalski's response was equally damning. Leave it to me, Chief. I'll document everything she does wrong until we have enough to fire her. These military types always think they're better than real cops. When the recording ended, the hearing room erupted in angry voices. Montgomery pounded his gavel frantically, while reporters scribbled notes and photographers captured his obvious panic. In desperation, Sterling called Detective Kowalski as his final witness, hoping that his testimony about Santos's insubordination might salvage their case. Instead, Kowalski's arrogant, defensive performance only reinforced the evidence that the entire proceeding was retaliation against a competent officer. Officer Santos ignored my direct orders, Kowalski testified, his voice heavy with self-righteous indignation. She refused to step back and wait for proper medical personnel. That's insubordination, plain and simple. Morales' cross-examination destroyed him methodically. Detective Kowalski, how many lives have you saved during your 20 years of police work? I don't keep count. How about an estimate? 5? 10? Police work isn't about keeping score. Officer Santos saved 7 lives during her military service, received commendations for medical excellence, and then saved Jake Morrison's life using the same skills that earned her a Bronze Star. How many people would be alive today if other officers had ignored your orders the way she did? Kowalski had no answer. As the hearing concluded, Montgomery and his panel retired for deliberation, but the outcome felt predetermined. The evidence of corruption, retaliation, and systematic abuse of authority was overwhelming. The only question was whether Montgomery would try to brazen it out or attempt damage control. After 2 hours of deliberation, during which hundreds of supporters maintained a vigil outside the building, the panel returned with their verdict. Montgomery's hands were visibly shaking as he read from prepared notes. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this panel finds that Officer Santos violated department protocols by engaging in medical treatment outside her scope of authority and by refusing to follow direct orders from a supervising officer. The crowd's reaction was immediate and furious, but Montgomery continued reading. Therefore, Officer Maria Santos is hereby terminated from the Chicago Police Department, effective immediately. As security officers moved to control the crowd, Maria sat quietly at her table, unsurprised by a decision that prioritized institutional protection over justice, competence, or human life. But outside the building, the real verdict was being delivered by hundreds of protesters, dozens of reporters, and a community that had seen enough corruption disguised as law enforcement. The battle for Maria Santos's career was over, but the war for the soul of the Chicago Police Department was just beginning. The termination decision lasted exactly 16 hours. By 6 a.m. the next morning, patrol officers throughout Chicago's South and West districts were calling in sick in unprecedented numbers. By 8 a.m., the morning shift was running at 40% staffing levels. By noon, 3 full precincts were effectively non-operational as officers refused to work under Montgomery's leadership. The sick-out wasn't officially organized. Police union leadership had specifically avoided endorsing job actions that might violate their contract, but word had spread through social media and informal networks that supporting Officer Santos meant not showing up for work. Officer Lisa Park, the rookie who'd supported Maria from the beginning, was among the first to call in. I'm not working for a department that punishes competence and rewards corruption, she told her sergeant. When Chief Montgomery is gone and Officer Santos is reinstated, I'll come back. The message was repeated hundreds of times throughout the day, as patrol officers, detectives, and even some supervisors made the same choice. The few officers who did report for duty found themselves overwhelmed by emergency calls they couldn't handle, creating a public safety crisis that made front-page news across the country. Mayor Robert Kellerman, who'd been hoping the Santos controversy would quietly disappear, instead found himself facing the complete breakdown of law enforcement services during the height of Chicago's tourist season. Emergency rooms reported increases in response times as crime victims waited hours for police to arrive at scenes. The political pressure became unbearable when federal investigators, alerted by Carmen Vasquez's findings, announced they were opening a civil rights investigation into the Chicago Police Department's pattern of discrimination and retaliation. FBI Special Agent Patricia Kim held a press conference outside the federal building, flanked by DOJ civil rights attorneys and U.S. Attorney Sarah Washington. We have received credible evidence of systematic violations of officers' constitutional rights, fraudulent use of federal funds, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of equal protection under law, Agent Kim announced. This investigation will examine not only the Santos case, but the broader pattern of corruption and retaliation that appears to permeate the Chicago Police Department's leadership. The announcement sent shockwaves through City Hall. Federal civil rights investigations had destroyed careers and sent officials to prison in other cities, and the financial implications were staggering. Chicago could lose millions in federal funding and face massive civil rights settlements. By evening, Kellerman had no choice but to act. He called an emergency press conference for 8 p.m., surprising reporters with the scope of his announcement. "Effective immediately, I am accepting Chief Montgomery's resignation," Kellerman announced, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I am also announcing the immediate reinstatement of Officer Maria Santos with full back pay and benefits." The crowd of Santos supporters who'd maintained a vigil outside City Hall erupted in cheers, but Kellerman wasn't finished. "Deputy Chief Rachel Torres will serve as interim police chief while we conduct a national search for permanent leadership. I am also appointing a civilian review board with subpoena power to investigate all disciplinary actions taken during Chief Montgomery's tenure." Behind the scenes, the personnel changes were even more dramatic. Detective Ray Kowalski was transferred to a desk job processing evidence in the basement. Lieutenant Patricia Hawkins found herself assigned to traffic enforcement in the department's most remote district. The three neutral administrators who'd voted to terminate Santos were reassigned to positions where they could do minimal damage. Dr. Kevin Rothschild's empire collapsed just as quickly. Chicago General Hospital, facing potential federal investigation for its role in the retaliation campaign, terminated his contracts and removed him from his administrative position. The medical board launched an investigation into his public statements about the Santos case, with Dr. Jennifer Walsh's documentation providing clear evidence of misconduct. Richard Sterling's law firm lost all city contracts within 48 hours, and state bar authorities announced they were investigating potential ethical violations related to his role in the conspiracy against Santos. The most satisfying comeuppance belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, whose military contracting company found itself under federal investigation for fraudulent billing practices. Webb's systematic sexual abuse of female soldiers under his command became part of a broader Department of Defense investigation that would eventually result in court-martial proceedings and criminal charges. For Jake Morrison, the resolution brought a different kind of justice. The Cook County District Attorney, embarrassed by the public attention to prosecutorial priorities, agreed to drug court instead of felony charges. Jake entered a treatment program that would allow him to get clean and pursue his electrician training without a criminal record. But the most important changes came within the police department itself, where new leadership began implementing what became known as Santos Protocol, explicit guidelines allowing officers with medical training to provide emergency care without fear of disciplinary action. Deputy Chief Torres, a respected 25-year veteran with extensive experience in community policing, made Santos Protocol her first official policy change. Officer Santos did exactly what any competent first responder should do in a life-threatening emergency, Torres announced at her first press conference. "This department will never again punish officers for using their skills and training to save lives." The protocol included provisions for additional medical training for all officers, partnerships with local hospitals to provide trauma response education, and clear protection for officers who provided appropriate emergency medical care. 3 weeks after her termination, Maria Santos reported for her first shift under the new administration. The precinct that had once been hostile territory now felt completely different. Officers nodded respectfully, rookie cops asked for advice, and supervisors sought her input on emergency medical protocols. The change was symbolized by her new assignment: Training Sergeant for Emergency Medical Response, a position created specifically to utilize her unique combination of combat experience and law enforcement knowledge. Her first official duty was to develop curriculum for the Police Academy's expanded medical training program, ensuring that future officers would have the skills and confidence to save lives in emergency situations. The financial settlement the city paid to avoid Santos's civil rights lawsuit, reportedly in the seven-figure range, allowed her to pay off her mother's medical bills and enroll in nursing school, pursuing her dream of eventually working as a trauma nurse while continuing her police career. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Jake Morrison, who completed his drug treatment program and returned to trade school for electrician training. On the 6-month anniversary of the night Santos saved his life, he sent her a handwritten letter. "Officer Santos, I wanted you to know that I graduated from treatment today, and I've been clean for 4 months. I start my electrician apprenticeship next week. I'm getting married to my girlfriend Sarah in the spring, and we want to name our first daughter Maria. You didn't just save my life that night. You showed me what it looks like when someone does the right thing, even when it costs them everything. Thank you for being the kind of person I want to be." As Maria read the letter at her desk in the precinct training office, surrounded by medical textbooks and emergency response protocols, she realized that every moment of struggle had been worth it for this outcome. A young man alive and rebuilding his life, a police department that valued competence over compliance, and a community that had learned to demand justice over bureaucratic convenience. The system had tried to destroy her for doing the right thing, but in the end, doing the right thing had transformed the system itself. 3 weeks after her reinstatement, Maria Santos walked into the morning roll call, expecting a normal briefing about overnight incidents and the day's priorities. Instead, she found something that took her breath away. Every officer in the precinct, patrol officers, detectives, sergeants, administrators, even maintenance staff, was standing at attention in perfect formation. The silence was absolute as Maria paused in the doorway, unsure what was happening. Deputy Chief Rachel Torres stood at the front of the room beside a podium that hadn't been there the day before. Her expression was solemn but proud as she gestured for Maria to come forward. "Sergeant Santos," Torres said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "would you please join me at the front?" Maria walked through the formation of standing officers, her footsteps echoing in the unusual quiet. She recognized faces that had once avoided eye contact, officers who'd been afraid to associate with her during the investigation, supervisors who'd treated her with suspicion, even administrative staff who'd processed her termination paperwork. All of them were standing for her now. Torres waited until Maria reached the podium before beginning to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here this morning to correct a grave injustice and to honor exceptional service to our community." She opened a leather portfolio containing official documents. 3 weeks ago, this department terminated Sergeant Santos for saving a young man's life. Today, we're here to recognize that her actions represented the very best of what law enforcement should be. Torres lifted a medal from the portfolio, the department's Medal of Valor, the highest honor that could be awarded to a Chicago police officer. "Sergeant Maria Santos, on the night of October 15th, you encountered a 19-year-old victim bleeding to death from a severed artery. Despite orders to wait for medical personnel, you immediately applied your combat medical training to stop the bleeding and preserve life. Your actions were technically perfect, medically necessary, and morally courageous." The chief's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Furthermore, when you were subjected to retaliation for your life-saving actions, you maintained your integrity and dignity while corrupt officials attempted to destroy your career. Your courage in the face of institutional persecution has resulted in fundamental reforms that will benefit officers and citizens for generations to come." Torres pinned the Medal of Valor to Maria's uniform, then stepped back and saluted, an honor reserved for the most exceptional acts of service. As Torres held her salute, every officer in the room followed suit, creating a moment of recognition and respect that brought tears to Maria's eyes. But the ceremony wasn't over. Torres nodded toward the back of the room, where the doors opened to reveal Jake Morrison walking in with a slight limp but obvious pride. He was followed by Sarah Chen, the paramedic who defended Maria in the media, Dr. 2, Jennifer Walsh, who'd risked her career to provide expert testimony, and Officer Tom Bradley, whose secret recordings had exposed the corruption. Jake approached the podium carrying a folded American flag and a framed certificate. "Sergeant Santos," Jake said, his voice steady and clear, "this flag flew over the precinct during the 3 weeks when you were suspended for saving my life. Every officer who supported you signed this certificate, and we wanted you to have it as a reminder that doing the right thing always matters, even when it's hard." He handed her the flag and certificate, then surprised everyone by giving her a brief, respectful hug. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like," he whispered. Dr. Walsh stepped forward next, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Sergeant Santos, these are letters from trauma surgeons, emergency physicians, and combat medics from around the country who heard about your case. They all wanted you to know that your technique was flawless and your decision was exactly right. They also wanted to thank you for defending the principle that competence matters more than bureaucracy." Officer Bradley, now retired but wearing his dress uniform for the occasion, presented Maria with a commemorative badge inscribed with the words, "Courage Under Fire," a recognition from the veteran officers who'd supported her throughout the ordeal. "Maria," Bradley said, "you reminded all of us why we became cops in the first place. Sometimes the job requires us to ignore bad orders and do what's right. Thank you for showing us how that's done." Deputy Chief Torres resumed control of the ceremony as the guests took seats in the front row. Effective immediately, Sergeant Santos will be promoted to Training Sergeant for Emergency Medical Response, a new position created to ensure that all Chicago police officers receive the medical training necessary to save lives in emergency situations. She turned to address the assembled officers. "Furthermore, this department is implementing the Santos Protocol, official guidelines that protect officers who use appropriate medical training to preserve life. We will never again punish competence, courage, or the instinct to help people in need. Torres's voice carried conviction that had been missing from department leadership for years. I want every officer in this room to understand something. Your oath is to serve and protect the people of Chicago. That oath doesn't include exceptions for bureaucratic convenience or administrative politics. When someone's life is in danger and you have the skills to help them, you have our full support to do whatever is necessary. She gestured toward Maria. Sergeant Santos embodies everything this badge represents: competence, courage, integrity, and an absolute commitment to preserving life. She is what we should all strive to be, and she deserves recognition, not persecution. The ceremony concluded with Torres reading the official commendation that would become part of Maria's permanent record. For exceptional valor and medical expertise demonstrated under emergency conditions, resulting in the preservation of life and the upholding of the highest standards of law enforcement service. Sergeant Santos's actions exemplify the courage and competence that define the Chicago Police Department at its best. As the formal ceremony ended and officers began to disperse for their shifts, something remarkable happened. One by one, officers approached Maria to thank her personally, not just for saving Jake's life, but for fighting a system that had punished excellence while rewarding mediocrity. Rookie Officer Lisa Park, who'd supported Maria from the beginning, was among the first. "Sergeant, I just wanted to say thank you. Watching you fight this taught me that being a good cop sometimes means being willing to sacrifice everything for what's right." Detective Robert Martinez, a 15-year veteran, was more direct. "Maria, what happened to you was bullshit, and every real cop in this city knew it. I'm glad Torres had the guts to make this right." Even officers who'd avoided her during the controversy came forward to apologize and express their respect. "I should have supported you from the beginning," admitted Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the doctor. "I was scared of Montgomery and Kowalski, but that's no excuse. You deserved better from all of us." As the roll call room finally emptied, Maria found herself alone with Jake Morrison, who'd waited while officers paid their respects. "How are you doing?" Maria asked, genuinely concerned about his recovery. Jake smiled, and she could see a confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there the night she'd saved his life. "I'm good, really good. 6 months clean, finishing my electrician training, and Sarah and I are getting married next spring." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "But I wanted to ask you something." "What's that?" "Sarah and I want you to be at our wedding. We wouldn't be planning a future together if you hadn't saved my life that night. You're part of our story now, and we'd be honored to have you there." Maria felt tears forming again, overwhelmed by the transformation from the despair she'd felt 3 weeks earlier to the profound satisfaction of this moment. "I'd be honored to be there," she replied. As Jake left to start his day, Maria looked around the empty roll call room where she'd just been honored by colleagues who'd once questioned her worth. The Medal of Valor on her uniform felt heavy with responsibility, but it was a good weight, the weight of recognition earned through integrity and courage. For the first time since that night in the stairwell, Maria Santos felt like she was exactly where she belonged, serving a community that valued competence over compliance, protecting people who deserved better than bureaucratic indifference, and working alongside officers who understood that sometimes doing the right thing required ignoring the rules. The system hadn't just survived her challenge, it had been transformed by it, becoming something worthy of the oath they'd all taken to serve and protect. 6 months later, Maria Santos stood before a classroom of police academy recruits, teaching the emergency medical response course that had become the most popular elective in the program's history. On the wall behind her hung a photograph from the night she'd saved Jake Morrison's life. Not the dramatic scene of blood and emergency, but a picture taken at his wedding 2 weeks earlier, showing Maria in her dress uniform standing beside Jake and his new wife Sarah at the altar. The Santos Protocol had become a model for police departments across the country. Within 6 months of its implementation in Chicago, similar policies had been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 12 states, and federal grants were available to help departments provide emergency medical training to their officers. "The most important thing you need to understand about emergency medicine," Maria told her students, "is that technique matters less than courage. Any of you can learn to apply a tourniquet perfectly, but you have to be willing to act when someone's life depends on it, even if other people tell you to wait." She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing statistics on officer-involved medical interventions since the Santos Protocol was implemented. The numbers were remarkable. Emergency medical actions by police officers had increased 300%, resulting in dozens of lives saved in situations where paramedics wouldn't have arrived in time. "Your oath is to serve and protect," Maria continued. "That doesn't come with asterisks or exceptions. If you have the skills to save someone's life, You have the obligation to use those skills. After class, Maria drove across town to Chicago General Hospital, where she was completing her nursing degree through an accelerated program for military veterans. The settlement from her civil rights lawsuit had made it possible for her to attend school while maintaining her police career, and she was on track to graduate in 18 months with specialization in trauma nursing. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now serving as the hospital's Director of Emergency Medical Education, had become both a mentor and friend. Their shared experience fighting institutional corruption had forged a bond that transcended professional boundaries. "How are the recruits coming along?" Walsh asked as they reviewed curricula for the Joint Police Hospital training program they developed together. "Better than I expected," Maria replied. "They understand that medical skills aren't separate from police work. They're essential to police work. When officers can provide immediate trauma care, they save more lives and build better relationships with the communities they serve." The program they'd created was being studied by medical schools and police academies nationwide. The combination of law enforcement authority and medical competence had proved powerful in emergency situations, and other cities were implementing similar cross-training initiatives. But Maria's proudest achievement was personal rather than professional. Her mother, Carmen Santos, had been able to afford consistent medical care for her diabetes thanks to the lawsuit settlement, and her health had stabilized dramatically. For the first time in years, Carmen wasn't choosing between medication and other necessities. "Mija," Carmen had told her during their last phone call, "I always knew you would help people. I just never imagined you would have to fight so hard for the right to do it." The fight had been worth it, not just for Maria, but for everyone who'd been inspired by her refusal to accept injustice. Jake Morrison had become a journeyman electrician and was expecting his first child, Time, a daughter they planned to name Maria Elena Morrison. Sarah Chen had been promoted to training coordinator for the city's emergency medical services, partly based on her principled defense of proper trauma protocols. Dr. Walsh had been appointed to the state medical board, where she was working to prevent future cases where political pressure undermined medical judgment. Officer Tom Bradley had come out of retirement to serve as an advisor to the federal investigation into police corruption, helping to identify and reform departments with similar problems to the old Chicago system. Even Detective Ray Kowalski had found a form of redemption, requesting transfer to the evidence processing unit where his attention to detail, previously used for harassment, proved valuable for organizing case files and maintaining chain of custody procedures. The broader impact reached far beyond Chicago. The Santos case had become required reading in police academies, law schools, and medical schools as an example of how institutional pressure could corrupt professional judgment and how individual courage could transform entire systems. Federal legislation was pending that would require all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to have clear policies protecting officers who provided appropriate emergency medical care. The Santos Act had bipartisan support and was expected to become law within the year. Maria's story had also inspired changes in military policy regarding sexual assault reporting and retaliation. Colonel Marcus Webb had been court-martialed and sentenced to 5 years in military prison, but more importantly, new protections had been implemented for soldiers who reported misconduct by superior officers. On quiet evenings, when Maria returned to her apartment, now a comfortable 2-bedroom place where she could actually have friends visit, she sometimes reflected on the trajectory from that night in the stairwell to her current life. The journey from desperate attempt to save a stranger's life to becoming a symbol of professional integrity had been painful and uncertain, but ultimately transformative. She kept Jake Morrison's original video testimonial bookmarked on her phone, not for ego or nostalgia, but as a reminder that individual actions could have consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine. One decision to ignore bad orders and save a life had ultimately reformed police departments across the country and inspired legislation that would protect future officers from retaliation. The final measure of success came in the letters she received weekly from police officers, paramedics, nurses, and soldiers who'd found the courage to challenge corrupt or dangerous policies in their own organizations. Many cited her example as inspiration to speak up when they witnessed incompetence, corruption, or indifference to human suffering. Sergeant Santos, read a typical letter from a paramedic in Detroit. "I was ordered to wait for police backup instead of immediately treating a shooting victim. I remembered your case and decided to ignore the order and provide care. The patient lived, and when my supervisor tried to discipline me, I had your example to cite as precedent. Thank you for showing us that professional courage matters more than administrative convenience." Such letters arrived from across the country and around the world, As Maria's story spread through professional networks of first responders who understood that competence and courage were often punished by systems that prioritized control over results. The most meaningful recognition came not from official ceremonies or media attention, but from the simple knowledge that her refusal to let Jake Morrison die had created a ripple effect that was still spreading, still inspiring people to choose courage over compliance, competence over conformity. Every morning when Maria put on her uniform, now bearing sergeant's stripes and the Medal of Valor, she was reminded that individual integrity could transform institutions, that professional competence was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or authority, but with the simple determination to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. The badge she wore represented not just her authority as a police officer, but her responsibility as someone who'd proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. As she prepared for another day of training future officers who would carry forward the lessons of the Santos Protocol, Maria Santos knew that Jake Morrison's life had been just the beginning of what she'd been meant to save.